"I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here," the saloon girl said to a lonely, giant cowboy. That's how it started. One storm, one stranger, one vow no one expected. She came barefoot through the snow, carrying nothing but a torn shawl and something she wasn't ready to speak of. He hadn't uttered a word in 20 years until her voice cracked the silence. The townsfolk whispered. The preacher watched, and something buried deep in that shack began to stir. But this ain't just a story about shelter and snow. It's about what happens when mercy meets memory, and the past rides hard to collect. When the dust clears, will silence protect them, or destroy everything they've found? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The winter wind howled like a hungry wolf across the Wyoming high plains, whipping snow into stinging clouds around Boaz Cutter's broad shoulders. His axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, splitting logs for the hungry wood stove inside his remote mountain shack. Though the day was fading fast near Millstone Crossing, he needed enough wood to keep warm through another bitter night. The thud of steel against wood masked the sound at first. But between strikes, he caught it, a faint voice carried on the wind. Boaz straightened his full height, towering like a pine tree as he turned towards the sound. There in the gathering dusk stood a woman, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Her thin dress clung to her frame, soaked through with snow. Her bare feet had turned an angry red against the frozen ground. Despite her desperate state, she held herself with quiet dignity. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here." Boaz studied her face, high Cherokee cheekbones like his own mother's, but fear in her eyes that reminded him too much of things he wished to forget. Without a word, he set down his axe and gestured toward the cabin's door. When she hesitated, he stepped back, giving her space to make her own choice. The woman, Susanna Vale was her name, though he didn't know it yet, took a tentative step forward. Her legs trembled beneath her, and Boaz's hands twitched with the instinct to help. But he kept his distance, letting her walk on her own power through the door he held open. Inside, the wood stove's warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Boaz moved with careful precision, each gesture slow and telegraphed as he hung a kettle over the fire. He pulled his spare wool blanket from the trunk and offered it to her with outstretched arms. Susanna took it, drawing it close around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, sinking down near the hearth. Her eyes darted around the cabin's single room, taking in the sparse but tidy space. Then her gaze caught on the wall, and she leaned forward with sudden interest. There, carved into the rough-hewn logs with patient care, were Bible verses. But not in English, in Cherokee syllabary, each character flowing into the next with graceful precision. Susanna's lips moved silently as she read, and Boaz noticed she understood the words. He busied himself preparing tea, giving her time to warm up and find her bearings. When the kettle whistled, he poured the steaming liquid into his 2 tin cups, adding an extra spoonful of precious sugar to hers. She accepted it with trembling hands, and he noticed scrapes on her palms, fresh ones from running through the woods. The question of what she was running from hung in the air between them, but Boaz didn't ask. He'd learned long ago that silence could be a kindness. Instead, he pulled his chair away from the table and settled near the door, giving her clear ownership of the warmer space by the fire. As night deepened outside, Susanna's shivering gradually eased. The tea's warmth brought color back to her cheeks, though her eyes remained wary. She watched him watching her, perhaps waiting for him to demand an explanation or claim the wifehood she'd offered in desperation. But Boaz simply rose once to add more wood to the stove, then returned to his post. When her eyes grew heavy, he spread his bedroll near the door and gestured to show she could sleep safely by the fire. Susanna curled up on her side, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Though exhaustion clearly pulled at her, she fought to keep her eyes open, watching him. Boaz remained seated, his broad frame between her and the door like a living shield. Eventually, her breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did Boaz allow his own eyes to close, though his ears stayed sharp for any sound of approach through the howling storm. Dawn broke grey and bitter, painting the cabin's interior in weak light. The storm had blown itself out, but 3 feet of fresh snow buried the landscape. The path Susanna had followed to his door had vanished completely beneath the white blanket. She stood at the window, staring out at the transformed world, her fingers worrying the edge of the blanket still draped around her shoulders. Without turning, she said softly, "I reckon I'll have to stay a little longer." Boaz nodded, though she couldn't see it, and began preparing breakfast. Whatever had driven her to his door could wait. For now she was safe, and that was enough. Morning sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows, casting pale squares across the cabin's plank floor. Susanna sat at the rough-hewn table, watching as Boaz moved about his morning routine with practiced ease. His massive frame somehow managed to navigate the small space gracefully, like a bear that had learned to dance. He set a steaming bowl of cornmeal mush before her, sweetened with molasses and dried berries. When she tried to stand to help with the dishes afterward, his large hand gestured gently toward her chair, accompanied by a slight shake of his head. The simple kindness in the gesture made her throat tight. "You don't have to treat me so careful," she said, but sat back down all the same. Boaz's only response was to fetch his medical kit, a wooden box with a red cross painted on its lid. He knelt before her, his movements slow and deliberate as he examined her feet. The frostbite had left angry patches across her toes, and she couldn't help wincing as he applied a pungent salve. As he worked, Susanna's mind drifted back to that terrible night at the Silver Spur Saloon. Marshal Drake had burst through the swinging doors, waving a wanted poster with her face on it. The charges were false. She'd never stolen from anyone, let alone helped rob a bank. But Hank, the saloon owner, had seen an opportunity. He'd offered to protect her for a price she wasn't willing to pay. She'd slipped out the back door that night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the determination to survive. Stories of quiet places up north had drawn her like a compass needle pointing true, though she hadn't expected to find sanctuary with a silent giant who carved scripture in Cherokee. Boaz finished wrapping her feet in clean strips of cloth, then draped his only quilt across her lap without ceremony. The fabric was worn but warm, pieced together from old wool shirts and backed with soft deerskin. She traced the careful stitching with her finger, wondering about the hands that had sewn it. As evening approached, Susanna found herself humming while she mended a loose button on her blouse. The tune grew into words almost without her noticing, an old hymn her mother used to sing while working in their garden back home. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound!" Her voice filled the cabin's corners with warmth. Near the stove, Boaz sat with his eyes closed, massive hands resting still on his knees. Something in his expression made her think he knew the song too, though he made no sound. When she finished, silence settled back around them like a comfortable blanket. But questions nagged at her mind, and finally, she gathered her courage to ask one. "Why do you live way out here alone?" Boaz's eyes opened slowly. He reached for the slate and chalk he kept near his chair, considering her question for a long moment before writing. His letters were careful and neat. "Some things don't deserve to be spoken again." Susanna nodded, understanding in her bones what it meant to carry memories best left buried. She didn't press further. Days passed in a gentle rhythm. Boaz tended his traplines and chopped wood while Susanna's feet healed. Despite her protests, he insisted she rest, bringing her books from his small shelf, worn copies of scripture and poetry, some in English, others in Cherokee. She found herself relaxing into the quiet of their days. Boaz's presence was like the mountain itself, solid, unchanging, protective without demanding anything in return. His silent kindness began to wash away the fear she'd carried since fleeing the Silver Spur, like spring rain clearing winter's grime from window glass. In the evenings, she would sing while he carved, her voice growing stronger each day. Though Boaz never joined in, she caught him watching her sometimes with a look that seemed almost peaceful, as if her songs touched something long buried in his own heart. It was strange, she reflected one night, how safety could be found in such an unlikely place. A remote cabin with a mute giant who answered questions with chalk and scripture. Yet here she was, her spirit beginning to unfurl like a flower after frost, finding room to breathe in the spaces between his silences. By the fourth morning, dawn painted the frost-covered windows in shades of pink and gold. Susanna stood from her pallet near the hearth, determination set in her jaw. Her feet, though still tender, had healed enough to walk without wincing. "I can't just sit here like a bump on a log anymore," she announced to Boaz, who was stoking the morning fire. "You've been more than kind, but I need to earn my keep." Boaz turned, his broad shoulders blocking the firelight. For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he gave a slight nod and gestured toward the kitchen area. Throughout the morning, Susanna fell into a rhythm of domestic tasks. Her knife made quick work of winter vegetables stored in the root cellar, carrots, turnips, and potatoes for a hearty stew. The familiar motions brought comfort, reminding her of quieter days before the saloon. The hearth needed attention, so she scraped away old ashes and laid fresh kindling. In a trunk near Boaz's bed, she found shirts that needed mending. The steady in and out of her needle brought order to frayed edges, much like Boaz's kindness had begun to repair her own worn spirit. While searching for more thread in a cabinet, her hand brushed against a leather-bound book. Pulling it out, her breath caught. It was a Bible, but the text was written in the flowing symbols of the Cherokee syllabary, her mother's people's writing. Boaz must have noticed her interest. He crossed the room in his quiet way and reached past her to take down a wooden board hanging on the wall. She hadn't paid it much attention before, but now she saw it was covered in carefully carved Cherokee characters, each paired with its English sound. "You made this?" she asked, running her fingers over the precise grooves. He nodded, then wrote on his slate, "To help remember the old words." Susanna felt tears prick at her eyes. Her mother had tried to teach her the syllabary before passing, but there had been little time between working and surviving. Here was an unexpected bridge to that lost heritage. That afternoon, seeking fresh air, Susanna walked behind the cabin. Winter-bare trees stood like sentinels against the grey sky. A stone marker caught her eye, weathered but well-tended, with fresh pine boughs laid across its base. Stepping closer, she read the simple inscription, "Anna Cutter, beloved sister." The crunch of snow announced Boaz's approach. When she turned, the raw grief in his dark eyes made her own heart ache. Here was pain deeper than words could express, carved into the very mountains themselves. Back inside, as evening drew its purple curtain across the sky, Susanna lit the lamp and began to sing. This time, she chose a hymn her mother had taught her in Cherokee, the ancient words rising and falling like water over stones. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar melody carried new weight in the old language. When she finished, she looked up to find Boaz watching her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Slowly, deliberately, his large hands formed a gesture she recognized, the Cherokee sign for thank you. The next morning brought an unexpected gift, a break in the endless snow. Pale sunlight pierced the clouds, and the wind died to a whisper. "We should ride to town for supplies while we can," Susanna suggested. "I noticed your flowers running low." Boaz considered this, then nodded. He brought her a thick shawl and a serviceable bonnet from a chest. Anna's things, she realized with a pang. The clothes would help hide her identity from any curious eyes in town. As they prepared the horses, Susanna found herself humming that hymn again, its message of grace echoing in her heart. Something had shifted between them in these few days, a recognition of shared wounds, shared heritage, and perhaps shared healing. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they mounted up. Boaz's horse, a sturdy bay, led the way down the snow-packed trail. Susanna followed on a gentle mare, wrapped warm in Anna's shawl, feeling strangely at peace despite the uncertainty ahead. The mountain trail wound down like a snake, each twist bringing Millstone Crossing into clearer view. Susanna held tight to Boaz's broad back as their horses picked their careful way through patches of ice and crusty snow. The descent took most of the morning, the winter sun climbing higher but offering little warmth. Susanna pulled Anna's shawl closer around her face as they approached the town's outer buildings. Already she could feel eyes tracking their progress. Wooden structures lined the muddy main street: general store, saloon, trading post, and a small white church with a neat parsonage beside it. "Look at that giant half-breed," a voice muttered as they passed. "Got himself a woman now." Susanna felt Boaz's muscles tense beneath her hands, but he kept his gaze forward, spine straight as a pine tree. They dismounted outside the general store, tying their horses to the weathered hitching post. Inside, the store clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, watched them with obvious unease. His eyes darted between Boaz's imposing figure and Susanna's partially hidden face. Boaz placed their items on the counter: flour, coffee, sugar, and a few other necessities. The clerk tallied them slowly, then cleared his throat. "That'll be $4 even." Susanna's head snapped up. She'd worked in enough establishments to know those items shouldn't cost more than $2. Before she could speak, Boaz was already counting out the money, his face impassive. "Boaz! Miss Vale!" The call came from outside. Reverend Elijah Elkins stood on the boardwalk, his silver hair catching the winter light. He smiled warmly, though his eyes held questions. "Won't you join me for coffee? It's fresh brewed." Susanna touched Boaz's arm. "We should go," she said softly. "Better to face things head-on." The parsonage was simple, but welcoming, with a pot-bellied stove radiating heat and the promised coffee brewing in a blue enamel pot. Reverend Elkins gestured them to sit at his small table. "I must admit to some concern," he began, pouring 3 cups. "The town's been talking, a woman staying unchaperoned with a good man who saved my life." Susanna interrupted firmly. She met the preacher's gaze. "That man found me half frozen in the snow. He could have turned me away or taken advantage. Instead, he gave me shelter and asked nothing in return." The Reverend nodded slowly. "And your intentions now?" "That man saved me from freezing," Susanna said, her voice clear and steady. "If I stay honest. No hiding, no shame." Silence filled the room, broken only by the pop of burning wood in the stove. Reverend Elkins studied them both, his weathered face thoughtful. Finally, he stood and walked to a peg by the door. "Take this," he said, holding out a heavy wool coat. "It's spare, and the weather's not done with us yet." Their next stop was the trading post for lamp oil. As they emerged, a woman in a fine dress stood blocking their path. Susanna recognized her as the wife of a prominent rancher. "Trash finds its level," the woman sneered, then spat deliberately near Susanna's boots. Susanna felt rather than saw Boaz's reaction, his huge hands clenching into fists at his sides. She laid her fingers gently on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "She's not worth it." The ride home was longer, the horses trudging uphill through deepening shadows. By the time they reached the cabin, stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Inside, as Boaz built up the fire, Susanna finally asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Do you regret it?" she said softly. "Letting me stay? The town treats you badly enough without me adding to their reasons." Boaz turned from the fireplace. His dark eyes met hers, and his hands moved in a single, emphatic sign. "Never." In that moment, Susanna felt something shift inside her, a determination taking root. The town's prejudice was like winter frost, bitter and biting. But she had found something worth standing beside, worth fighting for. In Boaz's quiet strength and unfailing kindness, she saw a truth that outweighed all their whispers and spite. The following week brought a gentle shift in the weather. Ice began dripping from the eaves of Boaz's cabin, and patches of earth emerged from beneath the snow like dark islands in a white sea. With the thaw came a new rhythm to their days, as natural as the changing seasons. Each morning, Boaz would guide Susanna in the ways of mountain living. His huge hands would wrap around hers, showing her how to angle the hatchet just right to split kindling without jarring her arms. Though he couldn't speak, his patient gestures and encouraging nods spoke volumes. "Like this?" Susanna would ask, mimicking his movements. The satisfying crack of wood splitting clean brought a smile to both their faces. Along the south fence line, where winter had worked posts loose from the frozen ground, Boaz demonstrated how to test each one, marking those that needed replacing. Susanna learned to brace the posts while he tamped earth around them, their breath forming twin clouds in the cool air. In the afternoons, he taught her to set snares, his fingers nimble despite their size as he shaped wire into careful loops. Susanna watched intently, noting how he chose locations near rabbit trails and beneath low branches. Their evenings held a different kind of learning. By lamplight, Susanna would open her mother's old Cherokee prayer book, its pages soft with age and use. She'd point to words, pronouncing them carefully, and Boaz would shape them with silent lips, his eyes intense with concentration. "Galikogi," she would say, tapping the Cherokee syllabary. "It means heaven." Boaz would nod, copying the motion of her mouth until she smiled in approval. In these quiet moments, something deeper than words passed between them, a shared connection to her mother's people, to faith, to hope. One evening, as rain drummed steadily on the roof, Susanna was folding their freshly dried laundry. She reached high to place Boaz's shirts on their shelf when her hand struck something metal behind a stack of blankets. A tin chest, small but heavy, tumbled down before she could catch it. The latch had sprung open in the fall. Scattered across the floor lay items that made her heart stutter. A cavalry insignia, its brass dulled with age. A war medal, its ribbon faded to a pale blue. And there, face up on the rough wooden boards, a wanted poster that stopped her breath entirely. Her father's face stared up at her, younger than she remembered, but unmistakable. The date read 1863, 15 years ago. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, recognition hitting her like a physical blow. The very regiment listed on Boaz's insignia was the one that had hunted her people during the removals. Heavy footsteps behind her made her turn. Boaz stood in the doorway, a load of firewood in his arms. When he saw what she held, the logs crashed to the floor. "Was it you?" Susanna's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Were you there when they came for us?" Boaz's face held such anguish it made her throat tight. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee before her. His hands began to move in the signs they'd developed between them. I disobeyed. His fingers trembled but kept forming words. I ran. Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. I saved who I could. Susanna stared at the items scattered around them, proof of a past that had torn her people apart. The medal that marked him as part of the force that had driven them from their homes. Yet here he knelt, this giant of a man, silently begging her understanding. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof as they faced each other across a gulf of history and hurt. In the lamplight, Susanna could see every line of grief etched on Boaz's face, every ounce of remorse in his bowed shoulders. The truth of their shared past lay between them like an open wound, waiting to either heal or fester. The night stretched long and heavy in the cabin. Susanna sat motionless by the dying hearth, watching orange embers fade to grey. The wanted poster lay in her lap, its edges worn soft as cloth. Outside, an owl called once, twice, then fell silent. She knew Boaz was out in the barn. His huge shadow had moved through lamplight before disappearing into the darkness. He'd given her space to think, to feel, to decide. The hours crept by like molasses in winter. When false dawn finally painted the eastern sky, Susanna's mind was clear as mountain water. She stood, joints stiff from sitting all night, and moved to the stove. The familiar routine of making coffee steadied her hands, measuring grounds, adding water, waiting for the pot to bubble. She set out 2 tin cups, one on each side of the rough-hewn table. The door hinges creaked softly. Boaz's massive frame filled the doorway, hesitating at the threshold. His eyes found hers, questioning, worried. Dark circles beneath them showed he hadn't slept either. "Sit," Susanna said quietly, gesturing to his usual place. "Please." He moved like a man expecting judgment, each step careful as he lowered himself onto the bench. Steam rose between them from the cups, carrying the rich scent of coffee through the morning cold cabin. "Tell me about Clear Fork," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a quiet request for truth. Boaz's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his slate and chalk, but Susanna shook her head. "Show me," she whispered, "like you've been teaching me." Understanding flickered in his eyes. He pushed back from the table and began to sign, his big hands moving with deliberate care. When words failed, he acted out scenes, pointing to his cavalry insignia, then making marching motions. He mimed raising a rifle, then throwing it down. His face twisted with remembered pain. Susanna watched intently, reading not just his signs but the truth written in his features. "You were ordered to attack," she translated softly. He nodded. His hands formed more signs, children hiding, soldiers advancing. Then he straightened his spine, lifted his chin, showing how he'd stood that day. Defiant. He pointed to his heart, then made a slashing motion, breaking ranks. "You refused," Susanna said. Again, he nodded. From his pocket, Boaz drew a folded paper, aged and creased. Opening it carefully, he showed her 2 names written in careful script. Sarah Whitecloud. Thomas Whitecloud. "The children you saved," Susanna breathed. Her hand flew to her mouth as recognition hit her. "Sarah, she was my father's sister's child, my cousin." Boaz's eyes widened. His hands moved again, forming the sign for silence, then pointing to his throat. He touched his heart, then lifted his hands to heaven. "A vow," Susanna translated, understanding dawning. "You took a vow of silence until—" He nodded, then signed, "Forgiveness." Tears welled in Susanna's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "All these years you've carried this? Waiting for someone to forgive you?" Boaz's own eyes glistened as he nodded once more. "Sarah lived," Susanna told him, her voice thick with emotion. "She grew up strong, married a good man from the nation." She reached across the table, taking his massive hand in both of hers. "You didn't just save 2 children that day, you saved generations to come." The first rays of true sunrise streamed through the window, painting them both in golden light. Boaz's shoulders shook with silent sobs as years of carried guilt began to crack and crumble. "Listen to me," Susanna said firmly, squeezing his hand. "You were never our enemy. Even when you wore that uniform, you chose right over easy. Mercy over orders." She took a deep breath. "The man who saved my cousin, who's shown me nothing but kindness since I stumbled to his door, that man deserves forgiveness." Boaz raised his tear-streaked face to hers, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "I forgive you," she said clearly, making sure he could read the words on her lips. "God as my witness, Boaz Cutter, I forgive you." Spring painted the Wyoming hills in soft greens and tender wildflowers. The morning air carried warmth instead of bite as Boaz and Susanna rode their horses down the winding trail toward Millstone Crossing. Their mounts' hooves kicked up small clouds of dust from the newly dried path. "Been meaning to check if Ma's letter arrived," Susanna said, adjusting her shawl against the breeze. Boaz nodded, a small smile touching his lips at her mention of family. The town looked different today, busier than usual. Wagons lined the main street, and clusters of men in city clothes stood talking on wooden sidewalks. Their pressed suits and polished boots marked them as strangers to ranch work. As they tied their horses outside the post office, Susanna overheard excited chatter from two women near the dry goods store. "Railroad men," one whispered, "offering cash money for land rights. Say they're extending the spur line clear through to Cheyenne." Boaz's shoulders tensed. Susanna knew why. His line shack sat near one of the few reliable springs in the area, precious water that would be vital for any steam engine passing through. Inside the post office, the postmaster handed Susanna a letter, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Cutter," he said, unusually formal. "Those fellows from the railroad been asking after property owners hereabouts, particularly interested in that spring up your way." Before either could respond, quick footsteps approached. Lolobegay, a young Navajo boy known for his speed of foot, burst through the door. His dark eyes were wide with urgency. "Miss Vale!" "Mr. Cutter," he panted. "Widow Martinez, the twins are coming early. Her oldest rode for the doctor, but he's 2 days out at the Carson Ranch. She's all alone with the little ones." Susanna grabbed Boaz's arm. "How far?" 3 miles east," Lolo said. "I can show you." They were mounted and galloping within minutes, Lolo riding double behind Susanna. The boy directed them across open range toward a small homestead tucked against a rise of land. Smoke rose thin from its chimney. Inside, they found Maria Martinez pacing, face drawn with pain. 3 small children huddled in a corner, frightened. Boaz immediately began heating water while Susanna helped the laboring mother to bed. "I've helped birth babies before," Susanna told her softly in Spanish. "You're not alone anymore." Hours passed. Boaz surprised them all with his quiet competence, signing instructions to Susanna while she translated. His huge hands proved surprisingly gentle as he helped deliver first one tiny girl, then another. Outside, Lolo kept the other children occupied with stories and simple games. As sunset painted the sky, twin cries filled the modest cabin. Maria wept with joy as she held her daughters. "Angels," she whispered. "God sent me angels today." The news spread quickly, as news does in small towns. By Sunday morning, the chapel was fuller than usual. Susanna sat beside Boaz in their usual pew, aware of the changed looks they received, respect replacing suspicion. When Reverend Elkins called for the first hymn, Susanna stood. Her voice rose clear and strong, singing the Cherokee words her mother had taught her. The melody of "Amazing Grace" filled the simple space, touching hearts regardless of language. After the final note faded, Reverend Elkins motioned her forward. "Miss Vale," he said warmly, "would you share a blessing in your mother's tongue?" Susanna's heart swelled as she faced the congregation. The words flowed from deep memory, a prayer for peace, for unity, for the healing of old wounds. As she finished, she caught Boaz's eye. He stood, his height drawing every gaze. His hands moved with deliberate grace as he signed a single word toward Susanna. Family. The gesture needed no translation. Several women dabbed at their eyes. The Reverend smiled broadly. "Amen to that," he said. "Amen indeed." After the service, people lingered to shake their hands. Maria Martinez hugged them both, her twins sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. Even the railroad men, watching from the back pew, seemed thoughtful. Standing in the spring sunshine outside the chapel, Susanna felt something she hadn't known she was missing. Hope. Not just for herself, but for this place, these people. For the chance to build something true and lasting, like the wildflowers taking root in winter's wake. Boaz's hand found hers, warm and sure. Together they watched their neighbors, no longer strangers, gather in the morning light, sharing news and laughter, planning spring plantings and summer celebrations. For the first time, they both felt truly home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor of Boaz's cabin when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the small space. Susanna looked up from kneading bread dough, flour dusting her hands. Boaz rose from his chair by the stove, where he'd been mending a bridle. A man in a crisp suit stood at the door, his hat tipped back, to reveal a clean-shaven face unused to mountain air. A silver watch chain glinted across his vest. Name's Harrison Wells, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat. I've got an offer here that'll interest you folks. Boaz's expression remained neutral as he gestured the man inside. Susanna wiped her hands on her apron, watching carefully. $500 cash, Wells said, laying papers on the table. For the spring and surrounding 10 acres. That's generous, considering you're technically squatting on federal land. Susanna's spine stiffened. Federal land, you say? Wells nodded, spreading out a survey map. According to our records, this parcel was never properly homesteaded. We've already filed intent to claim with the land office in Cheyenne. That's interesting, Susanna said quietly. Because my great-uncle helped mark these boundaries decades ago, this land was never federal to begin with. The agent's smile tightened. Ma'am, I'm afraid tribal claims don't hold much. Treaty of 1848, she interrupted. Article 3, Paragraph 2. The spring line marks the northern boundary. Her finger traced a line on his map. My people never ceded this land. Wells shifted uncomfortably. You'd need documentation to prove that. Then we'll get it. Susanna's voice held steel. Good day, Mr. Wells. After the agent left, Susanna turned to Boaz. Lolo's grandfather knows all the old boundaries. We need to ride out there. Boaz nodded, already reaching for their coats. They found Lolo tending sheep in the lower meadow. The boy's face lit up when he saw them approaching. Grandfather's at the summer camp, he said, swinging onto his pony. I'll take you. They rode for 2 hours, climbing into pine-scattered hills where the air grew thin and sweet. Small cooking fires marked the camp's location, tucked into a protected valley. Lolo's grandfather, John Begay, sat outside his lodge, silver hair gleaming in the sun. His weathered face crinkled with welcome as Lolo explained their visit in Rapid Navajo. The old man nodded slowly. The spring you speak of, we called it Talking Water. My father's father helped mark those boundaries with your people. He looked at Susanna. Your great-uncle carried the tribal scrip, yes? He did, Susanna said, but I never saw it. Because he gave it to the agency for safekeeping. The elder's eyes twinkled. Back when Samuel Turner was clerk. Turner's son still works there. A week later, Susanna stood in the dusty agency office while young Turner dug through ancient files. Boaz waited patiently beside her, his presence reassuring. Here, Turner said finally, pulling out a yellowed document. Tribal script dated 1849, never properly recorded but never invalidated either. Susanna's hands trembled as she read the faded words. There it was, her great-uncle's mark. The spring's location, the boundary lines. Legal proof that the land had never been federal territory. Boaz paid the filing fee, and Turner carefully recorded the scrip in his ledger. By sunset, word had spread through town. The railroad's claim might be worthless. The land could legally belong to Susanna's family. They rode home in golden evening light. At the cabin door, Boaz pulled something from his vest. The newly registered deed with both their names written clear and black. His big hands shaped a single sign. Ours. Tears blurred Susanna's vision as she took the paper. Through all her running, all her fears, she'd never imagined finding this. A home, a purpose, a future built on love and truth instead of lies. She pressed the deed to her heart, looking up at the man who'd offered shelter that stormy night, who'd shown her what real strength looked like. Ours, she whispered, forever. The spring burbled nearby, its voice as ancient as the treaties that protected it. On the horizon, storm clouds gathered over distant peaks, but here, in this moment, they were safe. They were home. 3 days after filing the deed, spring warmth filled the mountain air. At the general store in Millstone Crossing, Mrs. Henderson stocked new bolts of calico when the door swung open with a bang. A tall man in a dusty cavalry coat stepped inside, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. His face bore the weathered creases of long campaigns, and a tarnished captain's insignia gleamed on his collar. "Name's Captain Ruel Sykes," he announced, removing his hat. "Looking for information about these parts." His sharp eyes scanned the store as he approached the counter. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the fabric. "What sort of information, Captain?" "Heard tell of a big Cherokee fella, mute, lives up by Talking Water Spring." Sykes pulled out a creased paper from his coat. "Goes by the name Boaz Cutter." The storekeeper's face paled as she recognized the wanted poster, the same one that had circulated years ago, showing Boaz's younger face beneath bold letters. Deserter. I might know of him," she stammered. Sykes smiled without warmth. "Thought you might. Man that size is hard to miss." He laid the poster flat on the counter. "United States Army still has business with Mr. Cutter. Desertion during wartime carries a heavy price." Word spread through town like wildfire. By nightfall, dark clouds gathered over the mountains as 3 riders approached Boaz's cabin. Captain Sykes led 2 hard-faced men, all carrying army warrants and loaded rifles. Inside the cabin, Susanna was setting out supper plates when she heard horses outside. Boaz rose from his chair, a strange calm settling over his features. He seemed to have expected this day would come. The door crashed open. Sykes filled the doorway, moonlight glinting off his pistol. "Boaz Cutter, you're under arrest for desertion from the United States Cavalry." Susanna lunged forward. "No, you don't understand." One of Sykes' men shoved her aside. She stumbled against the table, dishes clattering to the floor. Through tear-filled eyes, she saw Boaz standing motionless, offering no resistance as they clapped iron shackles around his wrists. "He's a hero!" Susanna screamed. "He saved children from being murdered." "Shut your mouth, woman," Sykes growled. "The army doesn't take kindly to those who break ranks." In the shadows beyond the cabin's lamplight, young Lolo watched in horror. The boy had come to deliver evening milk, only to witness everything falling apart. As the men dragged Boaz outside, Lolo melted into the darkness, running for help. Townsfolk gathered at a distance, drawn by the commotion. They stood silent in the growing darkness, watching as Boaz was forced onto a horse. Reverend Elkins stepped forward once, then stopped at Sykes's warning glare. "Anyone interferes with army business," the captain announced. "They'll face charges too." The small crowd backed away. Doors closed, curtains drew shut. Susanna ran after them down the mountain trail, her bare feet bleeding on sharp rocks, until she couldn't run anymore. She collapsed to her knees, watching the riders disappear into the night with Boaz. By morning, Boaz sat in Millston's iron lockup, a cramped cell barely big enough for his large frame. He remained silent as ever, his eyes focused on something distant beyond the barred window. Susanna paced outside the jail, begging the sheriff to listen. "Check the treaty records." He was protecting innocent lives. "Army warrant takes precedence, miss," the sheriff said quietly. "Nothing I can do." As she stumbled out onto the street, Harrison Wells appeared, looking smugly satisfied. The railroad agent touched the brim of his hat with false sympathy. "Terrible business with the squatter," he said, producing the same envelope from before. "But my offer still stands. $500 cash for the spring property. Clean and simple." His smile turned cold. "Unless you'd rather try holding it alone." Susanna spat at his feet and turned away, her heart breaking. In one night, everything they'd built together, their home, their future, their fragile happiness, had shattered like glass against stone. From the shadows between buildings, Lolo watched it all with quiet intensity. His grandfather had taught him that justice moved in its own time, like water wearing away stone. The boy's hand closed around the deed copy Susanna had given him for safekeeping. He knew what he had to do. Above the town, thunder rolled across dark mountains. A storm was coming. Susanna's hands shook as she dabbed witch hazel on her bruised shoulder. The purple marks from last night's struggle stood stark against her skin. Outside her window, Dawn painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose, but she took no comfort in its beauty today. At her small writing desk, she dipped her pen in ink and began a letter, her writing careful and clear. To Colonel James Hartford, Fort Nolan Command. Sir, I write concerning Boaz Cutter, formerly of the 5th Cavalry. The man Captain Sykes arrested is not the deserter you seek, but a hero who chose mercy over murder. She paused, tears threatening to blur the ink. The words had to be perfect. Lives depended on it. After sealing the envelope, Susanna saddled her mare and rode through morning mist to Reverend Elkin's parsonage. The old preacher opened his door before she could knock, concern etched on his weathered face. "Child, I've been praying for you both since dawn," he said, ushering her inside. "Reverend, please." Susanna's voice cracked. "They're calling him a traitor. But I have proof of his goodness, journals, carvings, his devotion to Scripture. Will you help me take this to Judge Morton?" Elkin squeezed her hand. "The judge respects my counsel. I'll speak with him today." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But army matters. They move slow as molasses in winter. We'll need more." "I know." Susanna straightened her spine. "That's why I'm riding to Fort Nolan myself." The Reverend's eyes widened. "That's 2 days hard riding through rough country? Then I'd best get started." She found Lolo waiting by the church steps, already mounted on his sturdy pony. The boy's dark eyes held determination beyond his 14 years. "My grandfather says I should help," he said simply. "He says some debts must be repaid." Back at the cabin, Susanna gathered Boaz's belongings with trembling care. His journal filled with careful script describing daily acts of kindness, hand-carved Cherokee syllabary blocks he'd made for teaching children, the Bible where he'd translated Psalms of redemption into both languages, each stroke carved with reverence. They rode hard that first day, stopping only to water the horses. Lolo knew paths through the hills that cut miles off their journey. As they made camp that night, he told stories his grandfather shared about the old treaties, about promises made and broken. "But you and Boaz," he said, stoking their small fire. "You show how different peoples can live right together. That's worth fighting for." Dawn found them already in their saddles. By afternoon, Fort Nolan's walls rose before them, sun glinting off whitewashed timber. At the gates, Susanna squared her shoulders and announced herself with quiet dignity. "I have evidence concerning Boaz Cutter's case," she told the guard. "It needs to reach Colonel Hartford directly." They waited 2 hours in a sparse office before the colonel appeared. Older than Susanna expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He listened without interruption as she presented each item, explaining their significance. Finally, he picked up Boaz's journal and began reading aloud. "Today I carved another verse. Blessed are the merciful. The children I saved now have children of their own. Their laughter on the wind tells me God's grace is real, even for one such as me." The colonel's voice faltered. He removed his glasses, polishing them slowly. "I remember Clear Fork," he said quietly. "Ugly business. Wrong orders given that day." He looked at Susanna directly. A man who chooses conscience over blind obedience. That takes rare courage. His pen scratched across official paper, signature bold and clear. "This releases him from all charges. I'll escort you back myself. Been meaning to inspect that garrison anyway." Susanna's knees went weak with relief. Lolo caught her arm, grinning. "Grandfather always says truth rides a slow horse," the boy whispered, "but it always arrives in time." The colonel gathered his aide and 2 trusted sergeants. As they mounted up, he turned to Susanna. "Young lady, you've shown remarkable faith in justice. Let's go free an innocent man." They rode toward Millstone Crossing, hope rising with the dust of their horses' hooves against the golden afternoon light. Iron bars cast long shadows across the jail's dirt floor as afternoon light slanted through the small window. Boaz sat motionless on his wooden bunk, his large frame making the cell seem even smaller. Outside, Boot heels scraped against wooden planks as Captain Sykes paced. "World don't change for men like us, Cutter," Sykes drawled, stopping to spit tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "We're relics, you and me. Difference is, I know my place." He tapped the bars with his pistol. "And soon you'll know yours." Boaz kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his silence deeper than mere muteness. His hands, usually busy with carving or mending, lay still in his lap. The jail door creaked open, bringing with it the smell of fresh bread and coffee. Reverend Elkins stepped inside, carrying a covered basket. "Evening, Captain," the preacher said mildly. "I've brought supper for the prisoner." Sykes snorted. "Waste of good victuals on a deserter." "The Lord commands us to feed the hungry," Elkins replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Would you unlock the cell, please?" With obvious reluctance, Sykes produced the key. As the Reverend placed the basket inside, he smoothly slipped a folded paper into Boaz's hand. Their eyes met briefly, understanding passed between them. After Sykes escorted the preacher out, Boaz carefully unfolded the letter. His heart quickened at the sight of Susanna's neat script. "Dearest Boaz, the spring you protected all these years waters more than just the land. It waters hope. Hope for a better way between peoples, between hearts. I know now why you took your vow of silence. The weight of that day at Clear Fork, it's a burden no soul should bear alone. But you've carried it with grace, with kindness, with endless small mercies. I forgive you, not because I must, because I want to. Your silence kept faith. Now let love give you voice again. Susanna." Tears fell silently onto the paper, smudging the ink. Boaz pressed his hand to his mouth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Years of penance, of lonely vigil, of prayers carved in wood and stone, all answered in these simple words of grace. The peace of that moment shattered as shouts erupted from outside. Boots thundered on the boardwalk. Sykes burst in, whiskey on his breath and rage in his eyes. "That half-breed woman still squatting on company land," he snarled, fumbling with his gun belt. "Time to settle this proper." Boaz lunged at the bars, but they held firm. Through the window, he could see torchlight gathering in the street. Outside Boaz's cabin, Susanna stood on the porch, shotgun steady in her hands. A dozen townsfolk had gathered, but not to drive her off. They formed a line between her and Sykes's approaching figure. Mrs. Martinez, the widow whose twins Boaz had helped deliver, stepped forward. "This woman and her man saved my babies," she declared. "They belong here." Lolo's grandfather, wearing his medicine pouch, spoke next. "The spring was never yours to sell," he told Sykes. "The old agreements still stand." More voices joined in. The shopkeeper's wife, the blacksmith, even the ranch woman who had once spat at Susanna's feet. "We've watched them," the ranch woman said. "Seen how they help folks. Don't matter where they come from." Sykes swayed slightly, his face twisted. "You're all soft? This ain't how the West was won?" "No." Susanna's voice rang clear in the torchlit dark. "But it's how we'll make it better. This land ain't just dirt and water, it's hope, and I won't be moved." She stood straight and proud, her Cherokee blood and frontier spirit merged in perfect strength. The townsfolk moved closer, surrounding her like family. Back in his cell, Boaz pressed his forehead against the cool iron bars. His lips moved silently, forming words he hadn't spoken in 15 years. Words of gratitude, words of love, words waiting to be free. Hoofbeats thundered through the pre-dawn stillness, drawing every eye in Millstone Crossing to the eastern road. A cloud of dust preceded 3 riders, a military officer in a spotless uniform, flanked by 2 armed escorts. The lead rider's insignia caught the early light. Fort Nolan Command. Inside the jail, Captain Sykes jerked awake in his chair, nearly toppling his half-empty whiskey bottle. He squinted through the window, his weathered face darkening as he recognized the approaching uniforms. "What in blazes?" he muttered, straightening his wrinkled jacket. The commanding officer dismounted with practiced grace, his boots raising little puffs of dust as he strode toward the jail. The morning sun glinted off his silver hair and the papers he carried in a leather dispatch case. Boaz stood in his cell, hope warring with caution in his chest. Through the window, he could see Susanna standing among the gathering townspeople, clutching something to her chest. His old quilt, the one he'd given her that first stormy night. The jail door swung open. The Fort Nolan officer entered, followed by Reverend Elkins and the town sheriff. Captain Sykes scrambled to attention, though his salute wavered slightly. "Colonel Harrison, sir. What brings?" "At ease, Captain." The colonel cut him short, his voice crisp with authority. He pulled a document from his case. "I have here a formal release order for one Boaz Cutter, countersigned by the territorial governor." Sykes's face flushed red. "Sir, with all respect, that man's a deserter. He abandoned his post during an unauthorized action that violated standing treaties." Colonel Harrison finished. "I've reviewed the full record, including Mr. Cutter's personal accounts of that day. His actions saved innocent lives." The colonel's stern gaze softened as he looked at Boaz. Sometimes the highest duty is to one's conscience, not one's orders. "This is irregular," Sykes protested, stepping between the colonel and the cell door. "The company has interests." "The company," Harrison said coldly, "has no authority over military justice. Now step aside, Captain. That's an order." Sykes's hands clenched into fists, but he moved. The sheriff stepped forward with the keys. The cell door creaked open. Boaz ducked his head to clear the frame as he stepped out, his eyes finding Susanna through the window. She smiled, tears gleaming on her cheeks. "Mr. Cutter," Colonel Harrison said, "you are hereby cleared of all charges. Your service record will reflect that you acted to prevent civilian casualties." He extended his hand. "The Army regrets the confusion regarding your status." Boaz shook the offered hand, nodding his thanks. Without a glance at Sykes, he strode toward the door. Morning light flooded over him as he stepped onto the boardwalk. The townsfolk had gathered in a loose circle. The widow Martinez with her twins, Lolo and his grandfather, the ranchwoman who defended Susanna, shopkeepers and farmers and cowboys all mixed together. At the center stood Susanna, beautiful in a simple calico dress, his quilt held like a precious thing against her heart. Her dark eyes shone with joy and something deeper, a certainty, a knowing. She stepped forward, her voice clear in the hushed morning air. "You still haven't answered me?" Her smile trembled, but her words rang strong. "I asked if I could stay, if I could be your wife." The crowd held its breath. Even the morning birds seemed to pause their songs. Boaz looked at this woman who had brought light back to his dark world, who had faced down prejudice and threat with unflinching courage, who had fought for his freedom with the fierce devotion of a warrior and the gentle heart of a healer. His throat tightened. 15 years of silence pressed against his voice like a stone, but her love was stronger than any vow of penance. "Please do." The words came rough and quiet, rusty with disuse, but they carried clearly in the stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a bucket. The widow Martinez crossed herself, smiling through tears. "The giant speaks," Lolo whispered to his grandfather, who nodded sagely. Susanna's eyes widened. She took another step forward, the quilt dropping forgotten as she reached for his hands. "Say it again," she whispered. "Please." Boaz's second words came easier, carried on the wings of joy and forgiveness. "Be my wife, Susanna Vale." She flew into his arms with a cry of happiness. He lifted her easily, spinning once as she laughed. When he set her down, she pressed her hand to his cheek, thumb brushing away tears he hadn't realized were falling. The crowd erupted in cheers. Colonel Harrison smiled. Even the sheriff dabbed at his eyes with a bandana. Only Sykes remained apart, standing in the jail doorway. He watched as his old world crumbled, replaced by something he couldn't understand. A world where love spoke louder than orders, and mercy proved stronger than might. The morning dawned clear and bright, with petals from wild plum trees drifting like snow across the Wyoming hills. Near the sacred spring where Boaz's line shack stood, a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of cottonwood buds and fresh grass. Beneath the spreading branches of an ancient cottonwood tree, Reverend Elkins arranged his worn Bible on a makeshift lectern fashioned from a barrel. Wooden benches, borrowed from the church in town, formed rough rows where an unprecedented gathering took shape. Navajo families in their finest blankets, Cherokee relatives who'd traveled from the eastern territories, and townsfolk in their Sunday best. Lolo, dressed in a crisp white shirt borrowed from his older brother, practiced his scripture reading under his grandfather's watchful eye. The boy's fingers traced the lines in both English and Navajo, his young voice growing more confident with each attempt. Inside the shack, Susanna stood before the small mirror she'd brought from town, smoothing the folds of her sky-blue dress. The fabric, though mended in places, caught the morning light like water. Her dark hair was woven with white wildflowers, gathered by the Martinez twins at dawn. "You look like springtime itself," the widow Martinez said softly, adjusting the simple shawl around Susanna's shoulders. A knock at the door revealed Reverend Elkins. "It's time, dear heart," he said, offering his arm to walk her down the path they'd cleared to the cottonwood. Outside, the gathered community rose as one. Boaz stood waiting beneath the tree, his massive frame somehow gentled by the falling blossoms. He wore a clean black coat over his best shirt, his hands steady at his sides. When he saw Susanna, his eyes filled with wonder. The ceremony began with Lolo stepping forward, his young voice clear and strong as he read from Psalm 23, first in English, then in Navajo. The familiar words took on new meaning in the ancient tongue, speaking of green pastures and still waters to a people who understood their precious worth. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," the boy began, his voice carrying across the spring morning. As he finished the Navajo translation, heads nodded in appreciation of the bridge he built between worlds. Reverend Elkins spoke of love's patient strength, of forgiveness that heals ancient wounds, and of hope that blooms in unlikely places. His words touched something deep in the gathered crowd, a recognition that something profound was happening beneath this cottonwood tree. When it came time for the exchange of promises, Boaz's voice rang clear and true, no longer bound by silence. "I take you, Susanna Vale, as my wife," he said, each word deliberate and precious. "Before God and these witnesses, I pledge my life to yours." Susanna's answering vow trembled with joy. "I take you, Boaz Cutter, as my husband. Before God and these witnesses, I pledge my life to yours." Then Boaz did something that drew gasps of understanding from those who knew his story. He unpinned his cavalry medal, the one he'd kept hidden in that tin chest for 15 years, and with gentle hands fastened it to Susanna's shawl. The brass caught the sunlight, transformed from a burden of memory into a token of absolute trust. After Reverend Elkins pronounced them married, the celebration moved to tables set up near the shack. Women from town had brought pies and stews, the Navajo families shared traditional bread, and Cherokee relatives contributed wild berry preserves. Children played between the tables, while elders shared stories in 3 languages. As the afternoon light softened, the railroad agent appeared at the edge of the gathering. He stood awkwardly until Boaz noticed him and walked over, Susanna at his side. "I've come to tell you," the agent said, his hat in his hands. "We're withdrawing our claim on this land." He gestured to the surrounding hills. "There are better routes elsewhere, places without—" He paused, looking at the diverse gathering. "Such deep roots." Boaz studied the man's face, then extended his hand. The agent shook it, relief visible in his expression. "Thank you for coming to tell us," Susanna said softly. The agent nodded and slipped away, leaving them to their celebration. As sunset painted the sky in colors to rival Susanna's dress, the newlyweds stood together near their spring. Behind them, their community, no longer divided by old fears and prejudices, shared food and laughter beneath the cottonwood tree where love had spoken ancient wounds into healing. The weeks flowed like honey after the wedding, sweet and slow. Spring unfurled across the Wyoming highlands in waves of green and gold, painting the once barren hills with wildflowers. Each morning brought new colors to the land around Boaz and Susanna's home, purple lupines nodding in the breeze, bright yellow buttercups dotting the meadows, and crimson Indian paintbrush standing proud against the rocks. Boaz worked from sunrise to sunset, his massive hands steady as he shaped fresh-cut timber into sturdy porch posts. The rhythmic sound of his sawing and hammering echoed across the valley, mixing with meadowlark songs. Susanna would bring him water in the tin cup she'd polished to gleaming, watching with pride as the porch took shape, a proper sitting place where they could watch the sunset together. "It'll be just right for visiting," she said one evening, running her hand along the smooth, planed railing. Boaz nodded, his eyes crinkling with pleasure at her approval. Along the fresh-mended fence line, Susanna planted sunflower seeds she'd traded for at the general store. She worked the soil carefully, remembering her grandmother's teachings about blessing each seed as it went into the ground. The rich earth felt alive beneath her fingers, ready to nurture new life. "These'll grow tall as Boaz," she told Lolo, who'd come to help one morning. The boy grinned, measuring the height with his eyes. "Taller, maybe," he said, carefully spacing the seeds just as she'd shown him. Every Sunday afternoon, their home filled with the sounds of children's voices. Word had spread through Millstone Crossing that the giant who'd once been silent now read stories from his carved Bible, and that his wife knew songs in Cherokee that made the heart feel light. Parents began sending their little ones up the trail, carrying covered dishes and eager smiles. Susanna taught them simple Cherokee hymns, her clear voice leading theirs in ancient praise. The children sat cross-legged on the new porch, faces upturned and serious as they wrapped their tongues around unfamiliar words. Boaz would serve cornbread and honey, his huge hands gentle as he passed portions to the smallest ones first. The widow Martinez's twins became regular visitors, helping Susanna tend the sprouting sunflowers and learning to sign words with Boaz. He showed them how to whittle simple animals from soft pine, their small hands guided by his large ones. "My papa says you're teaching them more than just carving," Mrs. Martinez said one evening as she collected her sleepy children. "You're teaching them about grace." The days lengthened, warm and golden. The sunflowers grew strong, their faces following the sun's path across the sky. Boaz added a pair of rocking chairs to the porch, one sized for him, one for Susanna. He'd carved Cherokee blessings into the headrests, prayers for peace and contentment. As summer settled over the land, their evening ritual became as natural as breathing. They would sit together as the sun painted the western sky in flames of orange and purple. The breeze would carry the sweet scent of wild roses and sage, while crickets tuned their evening songs in the grass. Susanna would often hum the old hymns her mother had taught her, the Cherokee words flowing like water over stones. Boaz would listen, his eyes closed in peace, until the last note faded into the gathering dusk. Then he would open the carved Bible, its pages worn smooth with love and use. His voice, once locked away by grief, now rose strong and sure as he read in both tongues, first in Cherokee, then in English. The ancient words took on new life in his deep tones, speaking of mercy and redemption, of love that builds bridges between worlds. One such evening, as the last light gilded the distant mountains, Boaz finished reading and looked out over their flourishing land. The sunflowers stood tall against the fence, their faces turned west like golden sentinels. Children's toys lay scattered near the steps, waiting for the next Sunday's visitors. Inside, the kettle hummed on the stove, promising evening tea and quiet conversation. Susanna reached across and took his large hand in hers. In the soft twilight, she saw tears gleaming in his eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of profound gratitude. His voice came quiet and sure. "For once I was lost, but now I live." Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.